When Rabbi Eric asked me to share my story, my parents' story, I was honored and touched. As a new member of Beth Meyer, honored to be asked and touched by his interest in the account of my parents' Holocaust story of loss, suffering, and survival. This story is in the forefront of my heart and my mind. As a second generation, I am very closely tied to their experiences, closer than I ever realized. My father passed away in 2003, and then my mother in 2005. Like so many survivors, they spoke little about what they went through until later in their lives. Their silence served two purposes: to shield my brother and me from the horrors and suffering that they and their families endured, and to protect them from memories that for the most part had been pushed away into the recesses of their hearts and minds so they could put one foot in front of the other as they rebuilt their lives. How else could they live their shattered lives if not removed from the dark cloud that was interwoven into their neshama, their soul? Their stories are but two of the millions to be told. That said, their story is my story, and one I will always remember to keep alive. I also believe that it is all of our story, so that we too never forget the suffering inflicted and the courage it took to survive and move forward. My father was born Yosef Abramowitz in 1920 in Karelich, a tiny shtetl in Poland, approximately 125 kilometers southwest of Minsk, which is now Belarus. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Belarus and to see all the places I will talk about. I saw much that seems to not have changed in 75 years, yet I saw a great deal that was different. My father's family, observant Jews, were craftsmen. My father, Avraham Yaakov, was a glazier and carpenter. My grandmother, Zisha Gershowitz, kept their home and worked the small family farm. My father had a younger brother, Moshe, an older sister, Chaya, and an older brother, Chaim. My father went to cheder, religious school, and was well versed in Jewish history, traditions, rituals, and he knew how to daven. He also went to Polish public school as one of a small group of Jewish boys and girls. As a Jew, he was taunted by his Christian classmates. Complaints to his teacher were ignored. One day in 8th grade, boys ganged up on him and smeared pork on his lips. Although he fought back, he'd had enough. He told his father he was not returning to school. He then started working alongside his father. At 13, he was no longer a child, but part of the family's support. I sometimes wonder what my father could have accomplished with additional education, because he was smart, sharp, and a very fast learner. In August 1939, after making a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, the Russians invaded eastern Poland. It seemed to my father's family that the most significant change was the closing of synagogues and curtailing of religious observances. So, these were practiced in secret, and much of the rest of their lives went on. However, things changed drastically in June 1941, when the Nazis invaded eastern Poland. Jews were made to wear the yellow Star of David patch. Karelich experienced its first action, where hundreds of people are slated for execution. My parents called it a shritte, of which there were at least 4. Many Jews, particularly the intelligentsia, were rounded up in the town center. They were forced to march to a dugout pit, told to strip, and then shot. Townspeople were invited to watch. My father's mother, younger brother, older sister, her husband, and children were all murdered in this way. For me, the specifics of this horrific experience are vague, because I could never bring myself to ask my father to go into details. The remaining Jews in the shtetl were told to bring what they could carry and were confined to a small ghetto in Karelich. Later, they were made to walk the 12 kilometers to the larger Novogorod ghetto, which held all the Jews from the surrounding area in small, crowded cluster of buildings. These buildings were surrounded by a wood fence with barbed wire. An SS officer named Reuter was the commandant for the entire area. Words cannot begin to describe his cruelty. The Nazis assigned everyone to work at forced labor. My father and grandfather worked to clean up the rubble left by the Nazis' bombing. Hard, backbreaking work. They were provided with hardly any food or any water. Each day, people were lined up and divided into two groups. The strong, still able to work on one side, the weak, frail, sick on the other. One morning, my grandfather was assigned to that side. Although my father tried to sneak him over, his father was too weak and downtrodden to make the move. He told my father, "You are young, you survive." My father never saw him again. Later, my father was sent to clean out abandoned Russian barracks, which the Germans wanted to use. The Russians left in haste, and all kinds of material were left strewn about in piles. Once cleaned, the barracks were used for lower-ranked German troops. Officers were already living and working out of confiscated Jewish homes. One day, my father moved some blankets. These blankets were piled on the floor, and he discovered several rifles and ammunition. It was the end of the day, and the others had carried out some trash and were assembling to march back to the ghetto. He looked around just to confirm that he was alone, and he grabbed a rifle. He stuffed the barrel down the leg of his pants and secured the butt under his arm. Then, very tightly wrapped the oversized overcoat he wore and tied it extra tight with the rope he used. He knew that if he were discovered with a gun, he would be shot on the spot. Nevertheless, he marched back to the ghetto with it. Now, what to do with a rifle? As an experienced carpenter, he eventually found a loose board in the ghetto and hid the rifle until he could figure out what to do next. The following day, he asked to go back to the same barrack to finish the work, and he was told, "Schnell, schnell, quick, quick." He took just enough time to grab some of the bullets, hide them in his clothes, and report to the next work site. An opportunity was soon to come, which would be the miracle of his escape from the ghetto, certainly saving his life. In the meantime, within the ghetto, my father was reunited with his older brother, Chaim. My father learned that, unfortunately, Chaim's wife and children had been murdered. In the ghetto, stories, rumors, and gossip traveled quickly and served to feed the fears and hopes of the inhabitants. There was no real news, and people clung to what they could get. The rumors my father latched onto were of partisans in the thick expanse of the Polish forests, Jewish partisans who risked their lives fighting and hiding rather than being worked or starved to death or merely executed at the whim of a German or an unsympathetic Pole. The Belsky brothers, who had lived in a nearby shtetl, formed a group that in time became what would expand into a partisan community in the Nolibucky forest. The Belskys had witnessed their parents being shot in their home by the Polish police who worked with the Nazis. They vowed to survive as long as necessary in the dense forests they knew so well from their childhood. If you've seen the movie Defiance with Daniel Craig and Lev Schreiber, or read any of the books about the Belsky brothers, you're familiar with the story. The Belsky goal evolved from self-preservation into the mission espoused by Tuvia Belsky, the oldest brother and the leader, that it was more important to save Jews than it was to kill Nazis. My father wanted to be one of those partisans because he had a goal. He wanted to survive, to defend the memory of those he lost, and if given a chance, to fight for the survival of the Jewish people. My father, as we all knew him, was a quiet, unassuming man who followed the rules and didn't make waves. Nevertheless, back then in his early 20s, he was already a man of conviction, with a strong sense of what was right. A rumor spread that an older woman who lived in the ghetto was going to escape with the help of her son, who was a member of the Belsky troop. My father told me how he followed her around to glean information. He was relentless in trying to learn where, when, and how her escape would occur. She finally yielded and told him. My father made plans to be ready and to bring his brother along. On the fateful night, he once again managed to hide the rifle in his clothes as he did before. He met with his brother, and together they dodged the searchlights. Very stealthily, they made their way to the fence, all the while aware of the German guards patrolling the perimeter and those in the tower ready to shoot anyone who attempted escape. The older woman was already there, having slipped through a small trench dug under the fence. My father slipped through the hole as well. Just as his brother was about to follow, they heard footsteps. My uncle, frightened for their lives, went back to his place in the ghetto for fear of being shot. My father vowed to get him out. Looking around in the moonless night, my father realized he was one of several people who snuck out from under the fence, somewhat to the dismay of the man who came to rescue his mother. He must have been afraid to travel with more people than he had planned. He told my father to go back, to which my father says he replied, "I would rather die trying to save myself than let them kill me in the ghetto. I am going with you." And so it was. The small group walked all night and tried to sleep during the day. They ate what they could forage. In several days, they arrived at the encampment and were met by Tuvia Belsky. He was notified of their approach by some lookouts. When asked why he had risked coming all this way, my father opened his coat, displayed the rifle, and told them he wanted to be a partisan. Tuvia warmly welcomed him and would have done so without the rifle. It turned out that he was the only one who arrived from the ghetto with a rifle. Every partisan worked to support the troop. My father held two jobs. One of his responsibilities was the food detail. Food was precious and very hard to get. Some Polish farmers in the area supported Jewish partisans' efforts. They provided crops or livestock and often information heard in the village. In return, the partisans provided some protection and later goods they produced in the forest. Other farmers were not open to this arrangement, and from them, food was stolen. My father's other responsibility was to undermine the Nazis. Over time, the Belsky partisans formed an alliance with covert Russian army units. The Russians supplied weapons, explosives, and intelligence to all partisan groups. They, in turn, received some goods and services like shoes and uniform repair. More significantly, the partisans worked closely with the Russians to sabotage the Germans behind enemy lines. My quiet, unassertive father served on the detail that laid explosives under railroad tracks when German transports carrying troops and supplies to the front were scheduled. He said he didn't like doing it, and he did it nonetheless. He had a third task, to keep the commitment to his brother. Chaim did get out of the ghetto through a miraculous escape from a tunnel dug with spoons and hands by the remaining ghetto inmates. That tunnel was more than 100 meters long, longer than a football field. The tunnel ceiling was supported by slats from their bunks in the ghetto. In Belarus, I saw the tunnel entrance and exit, which is now part of a memorial museum. That's a whole other story. Chaim made his way to the forest and joined the Belsky troop. I can only imagine that reunion. Having lost parents, siblings, spouse, and children, the brothers were together again, fighting to survive and avenge the loss of their loved ones. They were the only ones from their family to survive. My father was proud to be a partisan, proud to be a Belsky partisan, knowing he stood up and fought when so many others were killed without having a chance. My mother was born Esther Grinberg in 1921 in Novogródek, Poland, also now Belarus. Also to observant Jewish parents. Growing up, she led a charmed life. She lived in a large brick house with her father, Chaim Yaakov, whom they called Alter, her mother, Sarah Brolnicki, younger brother Shimon, Uncle Moshe, Aunt Rachel, and her husband Belville. Her father and Uncle Moshe were partners in a kosher salami factory. That uncle was a shochet, and with his sister Rachel, my mother's aunt, ran 3 butcher shops. Her mother was a homemaker with excellent skills as a seamstress who taught young peasant women how to sew so they could have an income to assist their families. My mother and her brother went to Cheder. Later, they were allowed to take an entrance exam for Polish gymnasium because they were students who earned all 5s, the equivalent of our A's. There was a quota for Jews, and of the 24 who applied along with my mother, only 4 were admitted. When her family got word of the Nazi invasion into Poland in June 1941, they didn't believe that their lives would change all that much. During World War I, her father sold salami to Germans and developed a business relationship with the invading army. When the possibility of the 2 children coming to America came up in family conversation, my mother said she didn't want to leave her family, and the idea was put to rest. However, the Jewish refugees fleeing from the West into eastern Poland told stories of imaginable atrocities. How could the stories be true? The stories were true, and then some. The Nazis bombed Novogródek and then rolled in with tanks. The family tried to flee to a home they had in the outskirts of the city. The Germans, anticipating the efforts of the Jewish families to leave, dropped leaflets from planes telling the fleeing Jews that they would not be allowed to return to their homes. So they went back. Shortly after, Jews were rounded up for an action. Those who were not shot at pre-dug graves were forced into the ghetto, bringing with them the little they could carry. In the confusion, my mother's father was badly injured when bricks from an unstable building fell on him, and the family had to dig him out. Together, they managed to help him into the ghetto, where they took him to a makeshift infirmary. As my mother told me these stories in her later years, I was struck by the randomness of what happened to people. One day, for example, several young Nazi soldiers yelled into the ghetto that they wanted to have a party with entertainment. They demanded that 2 young, handsome boys come out. The Judenrat, the Ghetto Jewish Council, selected my Uncle Shimon and another boy. The other boy was Ray Kushner's brother, the great uncle of Jared Kushner. The entertainment was the boys would be dancing on twigs and leaves the soldiers set on fire. Having no choice, the boys followed orders. The young German soldiers quickly bored of this entertainment and left to get something to eat. Shimon ran back into the ghetto. The Kushner boy was burned so badly that he had to be carried. Shimon was taken to the infirmary and placed in a bed near his father, my grandfather. Shimon recovered. Unfortunately, my grandfather died of his injuries. Later, Shimon was taken from the ghetto by young Polish police who knew the family and offered to return him for a ransom. My mother raced frantically trying to find some valuables and took what she could to the jail. The police released him for the ransom. In the ghetto, my mother and grandmother were assigned to clean the rubble caused by the bombing. People who could no longer work were shot. Work sites were sometimes supervised by hired Poles. By a stroke of luck, my mother's supervisor was a young man she knew from gymnasium. He took her aside one day and told her that he had heard of another planned action. She should save herself if she could. My mother told my grandmother that she planned to escape from the work detail rather than go back to the ghetto. She would come back for my grandmother and asked that she and her brother meet at the ghetto fence that night. When my grandmother showed up that night, my mother was there, but my grandmother was too afraid to crawl under the fence, too despondent over the death of her husband, and uncertain about their fate outside the ghetto. She could not bring herself to go. Shimon was hiding in an attic and too afraid to come out because he knew he would be shot if seen. Days later, he was found by the Polish police, who planned to take him to another barrack near the ghetto. They thought they could hold Shimon there while they looked for my mother to give her another ransom opportunity. Of course, my mother had already escaped. On the way, they were stopped by Reuter, the vile German commandant, who told the police to take Shimon directly to the location where Jews were being shot. My mother never saw her brother again. This is a guilt she carried with her, literally, until the day she died. My mother also heard that my grandmother was executed as part of a large roundup where people were held and told to get down on their knees in circles facing inward and shot in the back of the head, one by one. Out of the ghetto, my mother needed to find a place to hide and wandered that night trying to find the homes of Gentiles who knew her family. By morning, she found the home of Zoshka, a peasant woman whose son worked for the family and to whom they had entrusted some valuables. Zoshka hid my mother in the barn. Somehow her uncle Moshe, David, a distant cousin, and Sonia, a friend, showed up. Since 4 people could not hide in the barn, they worked at night to dig a hole in the floor, which they covered with some boards and hay. They stayed in that dark, damp hole for nearly 2 years. They could go out only at night by climbing up a ladder and only to go to use the pigsty as a toilet, to leave no evidence of people other than the farmer's family living there. Often they subsisted on nothing more than raw potato peels. Occasionally, Zoshka brought bread for the 4 of them to share. Invariably, David would push to get to the ladder first so he could grab the food. What he gave the others was minuscule. My mother suspected that he was hoarding and only giving the others a small portion, so she tried her best to watch him. Once she was certain, she went to the ladder to catch him as he came down. She grabbed David's pants, pulled out the bread that he had taken for himself, and told him that he was never to go up the ladder again. Zoshka also provided information about what was happening in the area and told him about Jewish partisans who regularly came to her for food. Moshe wanted the partisans to take them into the woods and unfortunately got sick and died before they came back. He was buried in the floor of the barn in a shallow hole that they dug and covered with dirt and straw. All this activity frightened Zoshka because neighbors were known to spy on one another, and she was concerned about her family's safety. When the partisans came back, they did take my mother and Sonia to their camp, a walk that took several nights. When she arrived at the Belsky camp, she was amazed to see people she knew and that they were walking like free people. Some women gave her the first bath she'd had in almost 3 years, and they cut her hair to remove the lice. She had some food to eat and a bunk on which to sleep. She told me that she felt like a human being again. She was the only one of her family to survive. Not long after my mother arrived at the Belsky camp, the war turned against the Germans, who were pushed west by the Russians. The 1,200 Jewish Belsky partisans then walked out of the woods to make the trek back to Novogrudok. This part of their ordeal was over. Local farmers lined the path and watched in amazement that so many Jews had survived, practically under their noses. Surprisingly, my parents did not meet in the forest, but rather after the end of the war in a city near Novogrudok, and eventually made their way to a displaced persons camp in Cremona, Italy, where they married and I was born. That part of their lives is also another story for another time. For now, I want to close by telling you how proud I am of my parents for their will to survive, how I marvel that through all of everything they experienced, they never lost their faith in God and love of Judaism. That is almost incomprehensible to me. Were it not for the coronavirus, my brother, children, and grandchildren would be here today in this sanctuary. We are descendants of these brave, dedicated, loving people who went beyond what seemed possible to survive. And there are many, many more like us. I urge you, each of you, to share your story, whatever that might be. Every story is precious. And I believe that keeping these stories alive keeps memories fresh. Shana Tova.